welcome to the online briefing session for Unlocking Risk, Enhancing Hazard Risk Assessment through Historical Archival Reanalysis. My name is George Goddard. I'm one of the Node Research Managers at Natural Hazards Research Australia. I will be your host today. Yeah, excited to have everyone here, and it's good to see such a good turnout. I'm really excited to talk to you about this project. And yeah, I'll mention a bit about ways to play and other things today, so you feel confident in how you can engage and make the most out of the session. I'm just trying to make sure I haven't missed any housekeeping on my notes. Okay, yes, one bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded. So just to note, we will be recording this and it will be made available on the EOI website. So and that's part of our program to just make sure everyone's got access to the same information. Similarly, we'll have opportunity for questions and answers at the end. You won't be identifying those questions, but those questions and answers will be made available on the website too. And again, that's just to make sure everyone's got access to the same info. So yeah, that's just a quick note. And please, if you're not feeling comfortable, you don't have to come off. You can use the chat to put in questions, and you're more than welcome to do that through the presentation component. But we'd encourage people to come and say hi and video if you're comfortable at the end. I'll explain a bit more when we get there. Before we really get stuck into it, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're all dialing in from Aboriginal lands or Torres Strait Islander in some cases. Today, I'm dialing in from Yagara and Turrbal lands. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this land has always been a place of teaching, learning and research. And I've been really lucky in my career to work with a number of different First Nations communities. My background is in environmental management and sustainability and international development community resilience. I feel like I've learned so much just from that rich wisdom and knowledge of country, and as someone who you might have picked up doesn't come from Australia originally, I'm a migrant. So yeah, and actually in terms of my own understanding of sustainability, it's been fundamental to my understanding. And I wanted to introduce this artwork a bit just because one of my other hats that I wear is I'm the chair of the Reconciliation Action Plan Working Group. But this is a great artwork that was commissioned and put together by Leanne Brooke. And it's rich with symbolism. So there's a scarlet honey eater at the top there. That's a migratory bird between Queensland and Victoria, but that migration pattern has been shifting with the changing climate. And just to note, that's a form of adaptation that's really critical in a lot of the work that we do. Similarly, we've got the bugger moth there. That's to recognise the need for big talk and getting together to tackle some of these challenges that we have. And really, you'll get that as a theme of the online briefing today, where it's all about generating knowledge that can really influence the way people do things in a productive way. And I'll talk more around what impact and really the other stakeholders will talk to you a bit more about looks like for this project and that convocation. So the Bogong Moss, a number of First Nations peoples that get together and, around the time and come together. And on the bottom is the humpback whale, and that's a symbol of resilience, given that it was almost hunted to extinction not so long ago, and now is a thriving population. So there's that hope within there. But welcome and acknowledging country. So just to give you a bit more background of what we're covering, we'll do some introductions shortly. I'd really encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat too. So one of the reasons we run these online briefings for a number of reasons. One is so you have an opportunity to ask your questions that you might have to clarify. So obviously we have an EOI document out there that expresses the intent, but to give you an opportunity to ask questions that you feel you need to have a better understanding of, to be able to put in a really solid expression of interest. Another reason is that, particularly with this project, you might need diverse skill sets to be able to do this well. So actually being online, if you're comfortable, I'd encourage you to share your contact details if you're interested in forming a consortia. So we as a centre aren't able, when an EOI is open, to put people together and do that kind of matchmaking, but this is a space where you can do that if you're comfortable to. So please feel free to say hi, where you are at the moment, and if you're interested in sticking your hand up. Please just pop those in the chat there. This isn't going to be too formal. We tend to try and keep it. There will be a formal presentation. I'll tell you a bit about the centre if you don't know us very well. I think we're known to a number of you, seeing faces on the call. And then I'll hand over to Joe, who will talk to us a bit about, from SafeCom, who will talk a bit about the project background and objectives, and I'll introduce everyone shortly, as well as some of the project outputs and what the intent is there. Then it's back over to me to talk a bit about the governance and reporting and the EOI process. Then it's question time. So I get to do the dry stuff, Joe gets to do the fun stuff, and there's probably the summary there. So without further ado, I'll start to introduce more formally. So hi, I've already introduced myself. I won't do it again, won't take up the time. But I'd just like to introduce you to Ivana. Ivana, maybe say a quick hi. Ivana's here supporting today.
Hello, everyone. I'm a senior member of the Research Services team at NHRA and will be supporting this very important and exciting project.
Thanks, Ivana. And I'd like to introduce you to Joe as well at SafeCom. Joe will say a bit more of a hi later if you're okay, Joe, but maybe a quick wave.
Yeah, morning everybody. Well, it's morning on Ghana country today.
I'm going to try and sort out my audio. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and I'll try and suss this out so I can get a better mic.
Okay, so morning everybody. I'm Johanna Garner. I'm from SafeCom. I'm coming to you from Ghana country today. And yeah, looking forward to kind of filling you in a little bit about how we got to this point and to see if we can answer any questions you might have before you put in your expression of interest.
Thanks so much, Joe. We're also lucky enough to be joined by Matt Zanini from DFES and Jane Sexton from Queensland Fire Department. So maybe if you're just happy to come onto camera and do a quick wave, team.
Morning, guys. Nice to see you here.
And Jane, I know you probably just dialed in, so putting you on the spot.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. So thanks to you all as well for your time today. One of the reasons, again, we run these online briefings is actually to highlight the different nature of some of these projects. So with this, the centre, and I'll get into it shortly, but I'll explain a bit about the centre and how we operate. But these are really end-user driven projects. So it's not quite just like a grant where you go away, you take an idea, go away, do some research and bring it back. This is really good close working, and you're seeing some of the places that were you to be successful, you'd be working with on the project ongoing to come up with something that's going to be really useful and usable by people and stakeholders in the sector. A little bit more about the centre. So the centre commenced in its current iteration on the 1st of July 2021. There's been a rich lineage of different centres focusing on bushfire and natural hazards historically. This is the latest incarnation. We were funded at that stage for $85 million over 10 years from the Commonwealth, with a top up from partners such as SafeCom, DFES and QFD. And the core objectives of the centre are to protect human life and minimise harm and suffering, contribute to developing and supporting well-prepared and resilient communities, and invest in research that translates into action. So when we look at those objectives, it really highlights that we're looking to produce things that are useful, usable and used, because we can't, if the research doesn't result in people, the protection of human life and minimise harm and suffering, to do that, it needs to influence practice, and it doesn't do that unless it's useful. And that's why we operate in this way. So we're really end user driven as a centre to make sure that what the research that's being conducted has an impact. And that's really why we're here. So hopefully it gives you a bit of context on the centre. This is something that's going to keep coming up again as we go through. But like I said, one of the reasons we run these briefings is to introduce you to some of the people that are going to be supporting the project and came up with the idea in the first place. So I'm going to stop wittering. Hopefully you could hear all of that. And Joe, at this stage, I'm going to hand over to you to tell us a bit more about the project. So thanks, Joe.
Beautiful, thank you. And yeah, can I just thank you all for taking the time to sign up today. It's really nice to see so many people interested in it. My background, so I've worked in the sector for about 15-20 years now, I think, across 3 states, and I previously came to South Australia because I was managing a disaster resilience research institute. So I've been working amongst researchers and with researchers for a long time, and I know the power of what can happen when they work alongside the sector to try and address some of our issues. So that's a bit of a personal kind of passion of mine. And I'm also doing a PhD on cultural heritage in a disaster context. So being able to work with the GLAM sector, so galleries, libraries, archives and museums more broadly, and of course in this case obviously it's archives, is fabulous. And I'm completely and utterly biased about the work that sector's actually been doing to assist within risk reduction and resilience building and emergency management more broadly. So any projects which kind of highlight that work and engage with that sector, I'm very supportive of. South Australia has been doing a lot of work in the space with the cultural heritage sector more broadly. And so obviously to be able to continue that work in this kind of context is very welcomed. So basically the idea came about for a couple of different reasons. There's obviously been some previous work done kind of looking at historical archives. So there's been some work out of ANU, there's been some work with the Peri-Oz systems, there's been some work through geoscience, and obviously in a South Australian context, some of the work from, I think it was the ANU paper, was looking at historical data in terms of earthquakes, which kind of showed that maybe from a risk assessment perspective, it had perhaps been a little bit underestimated. And so that kind of sparked the idea about, well, okay, if this is perhaps what historical archives are showing us, and obviously there's been some issues accessing historical data previously in the archives, and now with digitization, etc., we're starting to see more and more of that information kind of become available. We wondered if could we do that perhaps at a bit of a bigger scale in terms of earthquakes in the South Australian context. And then obviously Jane and Matt were quite interested in it from different hazard perspectives. So we decided, okay, so let's see if we can do something and see if we can maybe develop some sort of methodology, or some, which is really where you come in terms of giving us some ideas around that, to see if maybe we've perhaps underestimated some of our risk analysis for previous hazards and the impacts of those. And of course, obviously, the other big thing that's kind of missing is the knowledge of First Nations communities around particular hazards. So bearing in mind, obviously, we have to be sensitive around some of that cultural considerations around information sharing. Certainly in South Australia, we've been dealing with quite a few Indigenous communities who have been impacted by flooding. And they've been very gracious in kind of sharing what they're able to around some of the kind of historical experiences and the way the land has kind of demonstrated and shown what some of the hazards have done previously. And so we're really keen to see if we can try and build upon that work a little bit further through this project in ways which are appropriate. And then obviously from that methodology and from the data collected, to be able to share that with others, and then for it really to become another tool for us to try and assist with our hazard assessments and our risk assessments alongside other data sets and other kind of methodologies we take into consideration. And yeah, so that's kind of how we've come to this point. And we're really keen to see what people think of the idea. And if you've got any questions around that, we're open to suggestions also. If you think there's some things maybe we could be looking at that maybe we haven't thought about in the expression of interest, we're open to suggesting some things with that too. And yeah, that's how we've kind of come to this conjunction today.
Yeah, I think it's really rich to get that context of where the aspiration is and all the rest of it. So looking at this, there's obviously, I think you've talked to the gaps that are there at the moment, the opportunity, and laid that out really clearly. But noting that we've got some thoughts on ways forward on it. So looking at, we discussed it, we tried to scope it into having those 3 case study regions and a way of going through it and structuring it. So having that lit review, online databases, primary source materials, but needing to really get there in person to different spots. And yeah, because ultimately just some of these still aren't digitized, and that's one of the current challenges with historical analysis. So yeah, getting there in person is something you're going to need to think about also when putting in your EOI and factor that in terms of travel and the appropriate engagement of First Nations groups in the regions that you identify. And when we talked about 3 case study regions, we're using region not in a formal bureaucratic division. It's more to just recognize that historical hazards have had a footprint that's different to current local government boundaries, and to make sure that it sort of covers off an area of interest. And Joe, just call me out if I'm misspeaking on any of this from your perspective. But and I think, Joe, you covered it really well already. So in terms of core outputs, you're looking for that methodology for translating historical accounts into characterization of the hazards that can really inform current risk assessments and the supporting databases. So thinking about the databases that might be used to inform those risk assessments that are held by Geoscience Australia, by the Bureau, whoever that might be. Also making that data, it's interesting, this is one we jigged around, but having a data catalogue just to note where that data was found, and so it is accessible and can be revisited in terms of the ones that you found for your specific case studies. Stakeholder presentations is a key way of socializing what you're finding, and actually it helps build that interest and appetite in doing further work in this kind of archival reanalysis. And noting that we would like to see this published because it will be of interest. So getting that into the international journals and open access usually is what the centre would aim for. And making that data available for inclusion in those authoritative national databases that I previously mentioned. So it can go plug into the Geoscience Australia or wherever it needs to go to influence the risk assessments in those regions. Joe, how's my driving there? Is there anything you want to call out in terms of those core outputs that are important from your perspective?
No, I think the thing for us is, is making sure that the data can be accessed by other researchers as we move forward, and obviously people within the sector too. I'm a big fan of applied research, obviously, so being able to kind of share the information as much as we are able. Depending upon the findings, of course, there may be some considerations around what might be made public and what might not be made public. We won't know that until kind of the findings are in, so to speak. But yeah, no, that covers everything.
Great, thanks, Joe. Nice to just check with Copilot that I'm doing okay. Thanks for that additional context there. And then there are other outputs. So these are still directly related to what we'd hope the impact will be, but a plain language statement is something that we tend to do at the start of the project, and being mindful of the considerations that Joe mentioned there. We still like to be able to communicate what it is that we're looking to do. The plain language statement is something that's like a sharper or a sharpened version of what's in the expression of interest already, that helps us communicate what it is that you're doing through the research, but a bit more informed by the actual methodology you're taking. Quarterly progress reports are just a part of the monitoring that we do as a centre. They're designed to be light touch, but they need to be considered in terms of your time. So it can take about 40 minutes through an online platform, designed to be light touch yet meaningful, and an opportunity to be able to check in with your project management committee, which should be formed of the centre, one of the lead researchers, and the end users that you see online today. So I imagine that would be Joe, Matt, and Jane at least. And project evaluation report, that inline evaluation, we can really understand what worked well, what didn't work so well, or we might think about doing differently on future projects. Also, what needs to happen next. And relevant communication outputs, including but not limited to presentations and posters. So it's just about getting it out there. Knowledge translation is so important to utilisation, and the centre is all about utilisation. And I think the bits that need to be is that actually one of the core outputs really around this is the project plan. So you'll put in an expression of interest and you'll be assessed on that basis. That's not the end of it. At that stage, that's when you get an award if you're successful and it's awarded, and then we start the process of contracting in the project plan. And the project plan is something that's really closely co-designed with the end users like Joe to make sure that it's going to have that impact. So maintaining the integrity of the research while making sure that what you're producing will have the impact it needs. And this is one of the great benefits of the PMC, is it's bringing together the expertise of yourselves as researchers and of the end users, the people that know what can be used and how it would be used and when. And that's what we want to land at the end of it. So, Joe, I don't know if you wanted to talk, like revisiting the outcomes here in terms of short term, we have more robust hazard risk assessments. What does that mean from your perspective?
Yeah, look, I think certainly from a government perspective, we use lots of different data channels, if you like, to try and build a picture in order to then help us not only with kind of planning and preparedness, but obviously policy development and so on and so forth. So this would certainly probably end up being one of those tools we might use in that kind of consideration moving forward, depending obviously on what the outcomes of the project are. And it would probably help us a little bit with scenario planning too, so training and so on and so forth for the services in that kind of response or recovery type scenario. And then I think obviously just trying to increase the engagement with First Nations knowledge too would be really beneficial. So as I said, we've done a fair bit of work in South Australia, trying to work alongside our First Nations colleagues in quite a range of different areas in emergency management. And so, yeah, for us to be able to continue to build upon that relationship appropriately would be really key, and to be able to learn from their historical knowledge, and particularly that connection to the land and how you read the land in terms of particular hazards, and how the land has kind of kept the hazard history, if you like, would be really lovely to try and engage with at a bit of a deeper level.
I'll talk a bit now about approach, which I've already touched on, before I get into some of the more of the nuts and bolts of how to actually get what it is that we're looking for, how to actually submit your expression of interest and so on. But a key consideration within your expression of interest is something that the assessment panel will be looking for in your method is, I'll just read this out because I think it says as well, but researchers are expected to undertake the research using a collaborative approach to assist in the translation and transfer of knowledge to end users. So it's important and great in terms of ownership that we know this research is desired by the sector, because we've got people from the sector sitting in the room today telling us about it. So that's a good start. To be able to make sure that that ownership and that utility is maintained throughout, we need that close working and collaboration. Otherwise, there's always a risk that it's going to start tailing off in a couple of different directions. Now, the PMC can help manage that. But also, we do encourage you to think about, well, how would you look to collaborate and engage the sector throughout? So we've got some loose outputs around communication. How can you leverage those opportunities to best effect? What do you think would be most valuable? We would also we would encourage you to consider being embedded at some point with end user organizations if you think it's going to be beneficial, only in as far as much as it helps achieve the outcomes of the research as stated in the expression of interest. So use your own judgment on where that would be valuable to do that. And just the basics, budget and time frame. Budget, we have allocated anywhere between 300,000 and $500,000, and that would be over a 3-year period. And that's to acknowledge the fact that there's a bit of work, and you'll see that in terms of what we anticipated the method might look like. So starting with your initial literature review and stakeholder engagement with the sector to understand which case study regions are really going to help land that method that we need at the end of it that can be replicated. But then actually having to take that time to be in person, to visit different archives and to engage with First Nations peoples appropriately, and noting, if you are planning to do that, budgeting for that. So, not expecting people to be offering their time and or intellectual property just freely when others might be paid for that. So please consider that. But yeah, 3-year time frame, and that's to allow for that rich engagement and to make sure you've got the time to be able to achieve that. So consider that when thinking about how you go about doing this and articulating your expression of interest. A couple of things to bear in mind in terms of governance and reporting. I've already touched on some of this. The way it will work is we strongly encourage consortia bids where you can, not that that'd be preference, but the benefit of consortia is it helps you reach outside of your institution and or your organization where you feel like you might not have all the skill sets that are required. Given the diversity of different hazards involved in this, so we're looking at earthquake, cyclone, storm, surge, you need that. You probably are going to need a diverse set of skill sets in here. Also noting that, one person might be stronger in the archival analysis approach versus other components of the research. So do think about that, please. But yeah, one person or one institution will be the lead and on the contract, and then it'll be up to them subcontract those other parties. The contract is with the centre, but the centre is also accountable to our stakeholders, right? So to Joe, to Matt, to Jane, and others that might use this research, but we're the ones that hold that contract. The project management committee I've already mentioned, that's a body that oversees the governance of the project, can be used as a resource to be able to make sure that it's going in a direction it's going to have an impact. There can also be a steering committee. It's not always the case, but it can be useful for this kind of project and a good central way of engaging stakeholders to identify areas of impact. And we would expect there to be regular meetings as part of this. And the PMC, Project Management Committee, does meet regularly to help make sure things are on track. Reporting, I've gone into this a bit already. You have your project plan is really a key deliverable because that's the co-design component after your EOI, if you're successful and you receive the award. Milestone delivery is part of that, and that's something that's also tracked through the quarterly reporting. Project evaluation report, there's the stakeholder presentations. And the one thing actually, I don't think I might have skipped over it earlier, but that final report is a really key output for making sure that what you have is accessible to everyone at the end of the research. The process is, oh, sorry, I should update that link. I'll update the link in the slides when they get forwarded around. Sorry about that, team, but you should have the link to the website and you can submit through there. If you have questions, we can't meet, but we can respond by email. So please forward them to research and they will triage effectively, and we'll get in touch with Joe, Jane and Matt if there's anything that we can't. Please don't reach out directly to stakeholders. It does need to come through the centre because that maintains probity at arm's length. Submission of EOI, they must be prepared within the centre's EOI submission form, and they're to be submitted to the same address as you send your questions into by 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Monday, 17th of March, 2025. Making a submission, the submission form has all this on there. So I won't spend too long on this, but a statement of capability, we need to understand, actually I won't go through this in too much detail because it comes through in the assessment criteria anyway, but why is it that you'd be good to deliver this? A statement around the diversity of the project team is just something we'd like to see because the centre is there to promote diversity and sort of blossoming within the research sector. So that includes early career researchers coming through, a diversity of perspectives in that research too. A statement about the project's inclusion and respect of First Nations peoples. That's true. We have this on all our projects. It's particularly true here, just given that potential for First Nations engagement. It will come through in your method anyway. That's going to be a significant component of what you do. An outline describing how the project team intends to approach the project, including an indicative methodology. A schedule of work with the interim milestones project outputs as described in the document and proposed project budget. And there's a template for that. So, and that should include details of in-kind, and that's consideration within the value for money. When we're talking about in-kind, it particularly relates to tenured academics who would be receiving salary anyway that would spend time on this project. And a clear statement describing the outcomes that will be delivered for this project and the outputs. Now, this touches a bit actually on what Joe mentioned earlier, which is we've got an idea around what this project can do and the way to do it. But if you think there's things that you could do in this project that would add value further, it only demonstrate your understanding of what the project is and what it's about. So please put that in. Please don't just copy in the outputs and outcomes as they are in the EOI, because that doesn't tell us much about what you've seen, how you do that. So, and that's explicitly assessed as part of it. It's how you've interpreted what this is about. You'll need a statement about demonstrating the project team's relevant stakeholder engagement. So that's really to demonstrate how you've engaged with industry historically. Base case, you mentioned how your institution's done it. Best is how the project team has specifically worked with stakeholders. Even better if you actually let us know how it went, because you can write that we worked on this. It still doesn't tell us if that was successful or not. So if you have some sort of statement around how that went, please let us know. But yeah, not everyone can do that, and that's fine. That's true of a lot of them. Risk management statement. Any requested changes to the centre's proposed form of contract, please do put that in. So look at the contract, it's linked on the EOI site, look at it, make sure you're comfortable with all the clauses. If you're not, let us know, because it's a bit trickier if that comes in as new information after the assessment and we start contracting. And up to 2-page CVs for each proposed project team member. Now that's really the only attachment you can put on this, or that rather, that's the only thing the assessment panel is allowed to review outside of the submission form. So please be careful of that. And I think I've spoken to most of this. Research capability is one of the criteria. Project approach is really important. So we need to understand how you're going to go about this. Project outcomes and outputs already touched on, industry engagement, and then finally value for money. So that's where we understand what you're proposing and the value relative to other expressions of interest in terms of scope of work that you've suggested and the method. And in terms of ways to play, 17th of February, we open the EOI. We are here. I like that box. We are here now. Mindfulness in a briefing. 26th of February, online project briefing. So this is your opportunity to ask questions. I think I'm leaving the 20 minutes I was hoping for that to happen. And then after this, you have until the 17th of March form your consortia, do whatever it is you need to do, and get a really clear picture that you can put into us of how you do this and why you think it would be important, how it would have an impact, because we're going with you. And we would hope to let you know by the end of April how that goes. So it's just to allow time for the assessment panel to convene, review meaningfully, and make sure that we're actually investing the kind of time that you probably put into developing it and actually assessing it, making sure we're coming up with a fair decision in that regard. And I think that's a thank you. So, and again, that's the wrong link. So just ignore me. I'm going to stop sharing because that's just embarrassing. But thanks, team. Now, hopefully you've been putting some questions in the chat. Even if you have, this is your opportunity to ask questions. Varna, I'm just checking quickly before we do that. Did I miss anything? Did I mislead anyone?
No, that was fabulous. And there are also no questions in the chat. Just really appreciate everyone introducing each other.
Yeah, thank you.
That's
part of the room. So if you had questions and you were sitting on them, you're like, I don't want to interrupt the flow. This is really lovely. Everyone's introducing each other. It's not really the vibe. I'd rather just ask the question. Please put up your hand and we'll get to you. So any burning questions. We want you to walk away feeling fully confident that you know what you need to do for the EOI. Having said that, it's not speak now, forever hold your peace either. You can still contact research after this point. And often that's the way, because it's when you start working it, you're like, oh, hang on. What he said made no sense at this stage. So, but yeah, please feel free to pipe up now. So, yeah, I can see the manual hand. So that's totally acceptable format as well. Yuki Towns. So yes. Is that your name? Sorry, I don't want to. Did I pronounce it well?
It's Ian Townsend. I'm from UQ. Yeah. I'm just wondering how an individual might make an expression of interest in joining any team that might arise from this.
It's a good question, Ian. So that's partially why we have this, right? So the context is the centre's somewhat limited in what we can do in terms of introducing. So the things that we can't do is we can't actively put people together because that's preferencing certain people that we'll be putting in, but we can encourage people to introduce themselves here and then maybe have a catch up. I would encourage you to reach out to your network as well. Barna, are there other things that we can do in terms of if there are people that are interested in collaboration? I think, again, it's tricky because once the EOI is open, we're quite limited in what we're allowed to do, and that's relating to Commonwealth stuff around probity, etc. And we are Commonwealth funded, so we're sort of holding to those guidelines here. But encouraging you to use this chat to see who you'd be interested in working with. Is there anything else that we can do? I'm trying to think. Sorry, I put you on the spot.
No, we'll just recommend dropping your email in the chat.
You're comfortable,
if you'd like. And to follow on for that, Solomon has a question in the chat as well. Am I eligible to apply as a lead org, or do I need or would prefer an institutional partner? Yeah, I would. We can't be very flexible on our agreement, our research services agreement. So often for sole traders, it's a bit challenging to adhere to all the terms of the agreement due to liability and all this not so exciting things. So I would just encourage you to review the agreement first. And if you feel like you're able to apply as the lead, by all means, go for it. But otherwise, we do really encourage consortium bids and to use this space to meet people and be a co-lead perhaps. But we don't do multi-party agreements, so we are just looking for one lead for this project and one organisation to have the contract with. So something to consider.
So it has happened, right, Varna? But it's unusual just because the levels of, I'll be honest, the levels of assurances that are required are prohibitive for most sole traders. But Solomon, you'll know your own situation best, so review it. And then if you have any questions with it, like I said, if there are things that you want to question within the clauses, you can put that in as part of an expression of interest. You can ask questions to research as well, but just noting that the centre itself has some ability to negotiate those clauses, but it can be quite limited, and that's because we ourselves are beholden to another agreement or a header, that means if we deviate from it, we wear something that we be able to. I can't really say more than that, so I probably should have said that.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just wondering whether there's a reduction in the risk of with the insurance and so on if you were with another organisation, but you'll be giving it to one person or one agency, I guess, or one company. Yeah, so no, that's
where
good
the
to know.
contract is held. So if you're part of a consortium, I'd encourage it. And it has happened that someone's been interested in participating, but they couldn't actually get the major university to lead it, and that was an issue. So when it would have made sense. So just finding the right person who's willing to play in that way is a good way to go.
Thanks.
So we have a couple of hands up too, which is great. Thanks, Simon. Ian, I hope we got to your question as well. That's as much info as I think I could provide on that one. But so Mara, sorry, I don't know if I pronounced your name appropriately.
That's all right. It's unusual. It's Kelmara. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering, the First Nations engagement is obviously a significant piece of this research, and ideally you'd bring First Nations people along in that. But if you don't know the case studies, you don't necessarily know who the local groups are that you're going to work with, because that's going to come out in consultation with the end users. I'm just wondering if the end users themselves have already got some kind of established network of First Nations people that can be sort of added onto, or whether this is really going in completely cold. And that's not to say that you wouldn't bring your own expertise and connections to those case studies, but obviously that's a point. That would take quite a bit to work out if it's completely in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question to ask, and I can invite Jane and back to speak. I think, Joe, you already spoke a bit about how you do have some of those relationships, so effectively it would be a warm-up. There's a certain level of trust that's already been established, and noting that, as part of the reason is that it could enable some of that trust building over time, and then also to lay the ground rules, in particular around Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, which actually our contract is quite supportive of. We took a while to get there, but it is there now. So because to enable that kind of participation. But Matt and Jane, in terms of, one of the things to note is the case studies don't have to be within these agency regions, and we've had that conversation. But having said that, there may be a benefit. I think you're starting to zero in on, and we would look more broadly. So you may have a steering committee that's broader than that. We could ask that network. But Kelmara, noting that you can't speak to specific groups, the best way to represent it is how you would approach that, and because for us, if you're looking at that as a significant component, we just need to understand that you're engaging or seek to engage appropriately. For example, Andor would have a budget line for the time of people engaged in that way, stuff like that. So those are probably the bits that you're looking for. Matt, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to add, I was encouraged by Joe saying that there was already in that sort of engagement, and that's ideally what you'd be working from, but it may not exist in every instance. So thank you.
Yeah. And noting it's an area of work as well that we're working on in terms of more relationships. So it's not always that trust building between different sectors and communities. But Matt,
Yeah, thanks, George. I was going to say, to address that question, obviously South Australia, Queensland and WA agencies certainly have some skin in the game here, and we'd like to enhance our hazard awareness. So we do have reasonable relationships with a whole range of different stakeholders, partners, land managers and TO groups across our state. So we can certainly assist in broaching those relationships and the like, obviously in keeping with the terms of the contract that's established with NHRA. All across WA, as an example, we've got reasonable relationships with traditional owner groups or land councils, as an example. So if there was a line of research that led us to think that, say, First Nations knowledge could enhance hazard awareness in certain parts of the state, obviously we'd be involved in trying to get the best outcomes for the researcher.
Great, thanks, Matt. I don't know if that reflects your position as well, Jane. Did you have anything you wanted to add there? Okay, cool. So I think and it's seeing where they're thinking about where the benefit might be back into the groups that are engaging, etc. through that. So it's a good consideration. But thanks, Kamara. It's a great question to ask. So and noting that it's probably going to, because you're right, I don't know what the case studies are. Interested in hearing your thoughts, but that would be a co-design process. So just knowing your loose approach of how that might go and considerations from your perspective of good new way. Chris, you've been very patient.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you very much for that briefing. My name's Chris Kouroumanis. I'm from the ANU. I have a couple of questions on very different topics. Firstly, it seems like many of the hazards and the research that you guys would like embedded in your EOIs focuses primarily on the last 200 odd years of documentary evidence. Now, a lot of the hazards that affect Australia have longer recurrence intervals or longer timeframes in order to evaluate appropriate risk, which requires that time component to it. Are you guys interested in looking at earth and environmental elements to these hazards? So, for example, if an earthquake has a recurrent history of 200 years and we've had one earthquake, risk is very difficult to determine, but there are geological and environmental archives of these out there. Is this something that you guys would consider?
I might defer to Joe, Matt, and Jane on this one if you're happy to think about how you're already utilising that kind of information and where the novelty is in terms of the archives.
Yeah, Chris, look, I think what you're alluding to there absolutely is still part of the spectrum of understanding. However, I probably would suggest that the intent of this project really is aimed at the archival reanalysis. So, I mean, it's absolutely complementary. I understand what you're talking about. I guess you're referring to paleo seismology, paleo tsunami work. That hasn't been explicitly part of this project concept as we put it up, in part because it was motivated about the fact that we have got an increased availability of archival information that we need to take advantage of. So that was really the motivation, but I'll pass to Joe or Matt if you've got any other views. And I'll say that's expensive. We all know that is super expensive.
Yeah.
That was going to be the only additional part of commentary I was going to say, Jane, is we couldn't look at potentially the 3 hazards which have been scoped within this EOI across the 3 jurisdictions for the funding available this round if we're looking at paleo work. So noting that there is an amount of archival material available, noting advances in machine learning, other technologies to archive it and categorise said information. Good opportunity to look at that, notwithstanding the benefits we can derive from other paleo focus.
Yeah, no worries. That was just a question. I'm curious, just to it helps us narrow our group scope if we were to potentially propose that sort of stuff. The other question I have, very different topic. How does this project relate to, and sorry, my camera's off because I'm scoffing lunch and nobody needs to see that. How does this project integrate or relate with, for example, the Australian Climate Service's work in looking at historical hazards as part of the National Climate Risk Assessment and the various state governments' risk assessment and adaptation plans and the future Australian Government National Adaptation Plan? Where does this project and the work that you're doing in the centre and specifically this project fit into those sorts of larger Australia policy agendas?
But the centre more broadly is a bigger question, but we have a number of rich relationships that inform those and sit on a number of different committees to bring in relevant data and research. With this research, and team, I was just going to take a first stab at it, and then you can tell me I'm an idiot with the wrong. I think that's probably what we're looking to capture, right? When we're talking about making this, a lot of the archival material is in a format or a characterization that's appropriate to actually inform those kinds of data sets at the moment, but there's an opportunity within this to do that. So it's very much part of it. And it also relates partly to your earlier question around the broader, or looking at that broader data is part of an ecosystem of data, and we see this as a key thread for informing those exact assessments. So yes, is the answer. It's a funny one, but in terms of how, was my view. But Joe, Jane, Matt, am I wrong in that? Am I mischaracterizing it? But that's very much the hope, is that it can inform those risk assessments directly, and that's part of the challenge, is how to get from here and it being in this format into this format where we can authoritatively inform those in a way, that people have a high degree of confidence in.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry to ask some curly questions of you, but much appreciated.
I hope I didn't put you off much.
I just would say, Chris, is that between Matt, Joe, and myself, we're all across and heavily involved in the National Climate Risk Assessment work. Each of us in different shapes and forms have had a footprint in our risk assessments in our own jurisdictions. So that was part of this motivation for the project. So we do have a pathway in terms of where this would go.
Solomon had a follow-on question to Chris's in the chat. Are you able to see that one?
Solomon, are you happy to speak to it?
Yeah, sure. It was very similar to Chris's. It was just about the existing databases that you have that we have at Geoscience Australia. There's quite an extensive database there. You're sort of looking to utilise all those existing databases and bring it in with sort of well, I guess, oral histories and historical accounts of hazards. I'm just wondering how you'd look at utilising everything that's existing.
What that says is that this is designed to be another thread feeding into those materials and systems that are already available, right? So Geoscience Australia and that database is an explicit part of the conversation while we were developing the EOI. We didn't want to specify exactly which, because there's a diversity of different hazards there, but that would be part of the mapping as well. Have I misspoken there, team? Is that not misspoke? My English is disintegrating, but in terms of, and Solomon, is that answering? Is that my answer would be, we would want this, ideal is that it could actually directly inform the database by translating some of the data into a format that can go in. But in terms of other considerations, and then there may be some additional that helps inform it from qualitative component, for example, but also help direction of research. Is that a fair?
Yeah, and maybe even things like are you looking for sort of public education or public engagement with this data that comes out?
That's an interesting question. So I think the primary audience initially, in my understanding, team, is we want agencies and different stakeholders that are involved in the risk assessments and that planning to be able to use it. And then a flow on. So it wouldn't necessarily be the responsibility of the project team to be involved in that component, but the flow on would be the agencies communicating risks differently as a result of it. Does that make sense? So
that makes sense. Yeah.
And again, pending me not being totally wrong on that. Okay, I think we're in a safe zone there, but I hope that helped a bit. Solomon, I just noticed another question that I thought would be good to look at. So, Mahedi, I understand this archival reanalysis focus on climate hazards from Australia, but are you considering international implications or learning from any global perspectives related to the project concept? I know of some other international examples. I was talking with our chief exec around some of the stuff that's been going on with in the UK with regard to some of these records as well. So I think absolutely learning from, and we are, one of the outputs we're looking for is an international, or at least 2 international publications and peer-reviewed journals. So that's an opportunity to contribute back into that. But I would expect we'd be learning from methods overseas as well and seeing how those might apply across or not as part of that initial lit review stage. But Joe, I can see you leaning forward. That may have been a comfort, or is that I want to have something to say?
Look, I think learning from work like of a similar vein which has been done overseas certainly can be included in the literature review, and I suspect there'll be some really interesting learnings from it as well, for us as kind of end users to be reading about and learning from. And I think Canada's done a fair bit of work with Indigenous communities over there around hazards and the kind of historical knowledge around that as well, if memory serves right.
Yeah. So there are good examples to learn from, but just noting most direct audiences, we want this to influence practice in Australia, and case studies do need to be centered within Australia. But yes, I think fair to say at the input stage of the project during the lit review, there's that opportunity, and then it will thread back out as we start publishing from it in terms of the method and so on, because others could learn. as well, I'm sure. Still, opportunity to ask any lingering questions. Don't be shy. I would hate for people to walk away with a sense of regret.
There's a really, I mean, when we went around Australia with the family, we went to Mount Gambier, and there's a really interesting story embedded in the local Indigenous groups there of the volcanic eruptions that they're our youngest volcanoes at Mount Gambier, only 5,000 years old, and they're observed by the Indigenous people and recorded in their stories, the three major eruptions there. And it's just a fascinating example of how, you know, big events, big natural hazards can get recorded and maintained in these oral histories. So I don't know if that's, you know,
no, Solomon,
that's the kind of thing you're looking to include, you know, or
it brings it like absolutely, because I think it relates to the earlier comment around, you know, the records go back so far. There's a deeper cycle on a lot of these events. So actually, and you know, noting that I've been aware of, there are still stories held within First Nations communities and knowledges around the land bridge to PNG and so on. So we're going back away, right? And I know there's been it's one of the things we need to be careful of, because in First Nations there's been a troubled history with research as well in terms of extraction. It's something to be mindful of. But there's this richness in noting that when those are more familiar with some of the protocols around knowledge translation is as rich and as self-regulating as much as a lot of the academic work that does go up because of that oral nature of a lot of it. The level of trust that needed to be there to be able to communicate to the next person and the responsibility shown leads to actually, it's just my personal reflection, the pain of knowing the arrogance that helped or led to a number of those languages and the knowledge that went with them being extinguished in some cases, though they've been resilient in many others. But I'm just thinking of when I first came to Australia, one of the great lectures I had in the sustainability when I was studying at Monash was from John Bradley, who was one of two people that spoke a specific language, and just noting that all the song lines, all the knowledge that goes with that language and is held. And that's where a lot of the communities I was working with, there was that desire of how do we make sure we have this knowledge and hold this knowledge with elders holding that knowledge, and then we want to make sure that keeps going on to the next generation, where there's been intentional disruption of that continuity of knowledge that was so well held for so long.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry, I'm going. But yeah, Solomon,
it's a classic aspect of hazard research is you know, forgetting the hazard, and it's just interesting that big events like this are often recorded and kept sometimes for thousands of years in these stories. So yeah,
it's the place names, right? So we've got so many European place names, but it might have been useful to know that was called the Poison Creek, or before people started. You know, the knowledge is there within the language often. So anyway, I don't want to go too far into generalizing, but yeah, I love that as a shared example. I think that would absolutely be something that would enable the richness that comes through in this research and the impact it could have. And like I said, it's just about making sure we do it in the right way, in a way that respects it.
Yeah.
And like I said, the centre's set up to facilitate that. So that's consideration in terms of we've had some really great leadership from Ollie Costello and others that have been working in our network at First Nations themselves to make sure that we make it possible for First Nations people to feel comfortable participating in the research and sharing those stories, and know that it's not going to just disappear somewhere or not be of benefit to them. So but thanks for sharing that. I love that anecdote. So I think absolutely. Team, we're nearly at time. Oh, sorry, Adele.
Just thank you. Just a quick question before we go. Could you just speak a little bit more about what you mean by regions? I thought this would come up. I'm going to be, I'm actually standing in for a First Nations organisation and who work mostly across a particular region, but I thought it would be helpful if you could let me know what you meant.
Yeah, so region isn't, like I said, I wanted to clarify, is we needed a word to try and capture that the hazard or the country might not be within a traditional local government area. So it's just to mention that it's probably an extent of area that covers or is transboundary across multiple local government areas, but relates because noting that hazards don't really observe our chosen bureaucracy in terms of how we cut Australia up into administrative zones. So really, when we mention regions, that's all it's referring to. It's like it's an area, but it doesn't need to be defined within the specific local government boundaries. It probably would be transboundary anyway, but it relates more to the where that hazard is relevant and the kind of impact it might have. But certainly, it might align to where particular communities that need to potentially update their risk assessments to line at the moment. So I don't. Yeah, sorry. It is a woolly term. I was puzzling out like, how do I explain this? But how do I communicate that intent, which is it's something bigger than just we're interested in X local government, and yeah, to actually respect the fact that actually country doesn't observe those specific boundaries in that way as well. I hope that helps a bit. It's still woolly, but
yeah, I'm just thinking. So it's 3 regions that experience the same hazard.
Well, not necessarily, because there's 3 different hazards as well. So it'd be the regions would enable a rich understanding across those. So ideally, we have a method that does that. Ideally, to save yourself time, a region that you're looking at, it's going to be partly informed around where the archives are as well, right? So it's one of the practicalities. But if there's an efficiency in like searching multiple terms at the same time using AI or whatever it might be within that in the same region, it's not that. But we'd hope to at least cover off on all those 3, and then there'd be 3 regions just for that point of comparison. We say minimal, but we'll take your advice on what the method looks like. So, and what would actually lead to the outcome. So really, that's the thinking, but we're interested in having that outcome as something that we can replicate in other areas, so we can have really rich data informing the hazard assessment and understanding. Yeah, sorry, it's a tricky one to explain, and hopefully not a bum note. But I just wanted to say it's really lovely to see such a diverse team in the room today, and a big thanks to you all. I know we're slightly over the hour, but there are no more questions. Like I said, it's not speak now or forever hold your peace. Please do get in touch with us at research@naturalhazards.com.au. But I really appreciate you all taking the time to listen today and your interest in the project. I'm really interested to see what you come up with. So we're learning as well. We're keen to hear what it is that you think we can get out of this too. So please, if you have any questions, just be in touch. But good luck as well. I can say good luck to all of you. And all of you watching the recording who don't happen to be in the room today. So I'm not preferencing any one provider over the other. But yeah, anyway. Thanks, team.